JavaScript is a magical unicorn. It can do magical things if you program it properly and if you use certain aspects of the language. However, like most people, I started learning JavaScript by not learning JavaScript, by actually learning a library called jQuery. jQuery is an extremely popular and well-known JavaScript library, and that's because a lot of people don't actually want to learn the syntax of JavaScript. They think it's confusing, and quite rightly so. When you come to this language, when you first peer into JavaScript, it can be a little bit daunting to understand exactly what it is and figure out this magical unicorn that's now permeating every type of application you can imagine. It's on the desktop, it's in mobile apps, it's now on the web server, and of course, as it always has been, it has been on the client side in the browsers. So we really do have to figure out what exactly is JavaScript. And not only that, we have to figure out the good parts, and also you have to figure out the bad parts with JavaScript. And yes, with any programming language, there's going to be bad parts. And I'm not even going to bother pitting this language against any other language. That's just not what we're here to do. Really, we're here to sit back, enjoy, and learn JavaScript simply. Now, we all start out as beginners in any language. And then you have the gurus of the language, which understand all the terminologies and all the rest of it. And it can get very technical very quickly. And the problem is there's a lot of JavaScript gurus out there that don't explain simple concepts. And if they explain a concept, it's very, very difficult. One of the examples in JavaScript is prototype. You may not have heard of prototype, you may be completely new to JavaScript, you may be completely new to programming, which is absolutely fine, don't get confused by this. But if you are somebody who sort of has a taste of JavaScript, you've had a taste of that, a lemon on the screen right there, then you sort of go, oh, okay, but what is prototype? Because a lot of people go, what is this crap? What is that prototype? I don't understand it at all. And it's quite a powerful thing. And all it is a shared object. And that's a simple way of putting it, and it's a truthful way of putting it. So I've told you the truth, and I've told you it simply. And again, I will explain that at a later date, but that's the whole point about this course, and that's what I will be doing, is taking really advanced stuff in the language, which isn't really advanced at all, and just explaining it in the most simple way, and clearing out all of those technical terms that people just don't understand, and especially people that are new to programming languages or programming in general. They normally start with JavaScript, which is exactly what this course is going to do. It's also going to be extremely basic, and we're going to add brick by brick by brick until we end up with the big picture, the full house, everything. Now, what I'm going to do in this lecture from here on out is explain the history of JavaScript, because a lot of programmers can understand the syntax of JavaScript, but they never really understood where it came from, how it came about, who created it, how quickly it was created, and you'll be quite shocked when I tell you that one. And that's why it's really important for us to understand this, because it's another string to your bow. Any information you can gain to add a foundation is what you want to do. And that's exactly what I want to do right now, right here, is explain the history. Very quickly, before I actually go into the history, as I go through the history, new names will emerge. We have LiveScript, JScript, ECMAScript, and JavaScript. So there are 4 different names. Now, if you imagine taking a car, debadging it, and sticking another badge on it, and you do that 2 or 3 times over, you've still got the same car. It's just got a different badge on it. Well, it's the same with this language. You could call it JavaScript, you could call it ECMAScript, you could call it LiveScript, you could call it JScript. It doesn't matter what name you give it. I will explain why all these names exist. You are referring to the same language. You've still got the same car, you've just got a different badge. So the history always starts with the seed. And the seed is, why was this language created? That's the most important thing. Why was it created in the first place? The reason why it was created in the first place is because back in the early 90s, you could create web pages using HTML and CSS. So you could provide information through HTML, so people could see text and images, and you could make the page look nice via CSS. However, it couldn't really keep up with desktop apps. Web apps were, extremely basic. And, you had to click a link and that link refreshed the page and brought in new data and so on and so forth. And it wasn't really good enough. So we wanted more interactivity. Well, if you want more interactivity, you have to invent another language to do that. And so as we already had HTML and CSS, we just needed one last language to give us the interactivity. And so this is why JavaScript, or whatever name you want to give it, was created. Now this language first appeared in Netscape. Netscape was an extremely popular browser back in the 90s, and it's still actually a well-known name. Some people may know what it is, but it's basically a browser, and it was a very, very popular browser in the 90s, just like Chrome is today, and so on and so forth. So what happened was Netscape introduced LiveScript, which allowed interactivity for your web apps. Very, very good idea. And LiveScript was created by someone called Brendan Eich. Very, very clever individual. Very, very clever. Because he created LiveScript, and this is the shocker, in 10 days. In 1995, 10 days, Brendan Eich created LiveScript. Now, of course, there have been additions to this language since, but that is very, very impressive. And he was told, because Sun Microsystems and Netscape were teamed up at that time, Sun Microsystems basically architectured Java. Today, Oracle owns Sun Microsystems. Oracle bought Sun Microsystems out. But back then it was Netscape and Sun Microsystems. And Sun Microsystems, their golden child was Java. They loved it. And so they said to Brendan Eich, look, get Java. And then also he introduced two other languages, Self and Scheme. So he took Java, Self and Scheme, and he combined them together, and it created LiveScript. Java because he was told to, but he didn't actually want to go with Java. Now, the problem is that Java is not an easy language for beginners, and Brendan was very, very clever, very, very smart and forward-thinking, saying, why shouldn't we create a simple language that most people can get along with? So you'll actually find there's hardly anything that is Java-related in LiveScript. In fact, hardly nothing at all. But Self and Scheme are not known to programmers today because those languages have completely failed. Nobody's learning Self and Scheme, but they are known to program architects. So what do I mean by program architect? Well, that's somebody who constructs a language like Brendan Eich constructing LiveScript, designing the language, designing the syntax. Self and Scheme are actually known among those individuals because they were fantastic languages. And so a lot of Self and Scheme is actually in LiveScript, or what we, mostly call today JavaScript, but there are other names for this language. And you can see how it's taken off, and it's such a wonderful thing. But however, it was created. Now, it was sort of a little bit of a joke, and there was tension between Netscape and Sun Microsystems because of this, because really Brendan ignored the instruction to use Java in the syntax. He sort of ignored that. And so the joke was they renamed LiveScript to JavaScript. So now we have two silly names for one silly language. And that caused tension, of course, between the relationship between Netscape and Sun Microsystems. But we now have two names, and the problem with JavaScript, the problem with that name, is that it creates confusion. Now, even though Brendan was told to, utilize the Java language in LiveScript, he didn't really. I mean, it's fairly obvious today that he did not do that, and that has been the case ever since. And many people think that JavaScript and Java are related. They're completely different languages. I mean, you couldn't get two languages further apart if you tried. So they are two different things. So I don't like that joke because it's created so much confusion to this day. But unfortunately, that's what happened. So it's a running joke. It's an undocumented joke. But they called it JavaScript to, sort of rub Sun's face in it, I guess. I don't know. Or just keep them happy. Well, it turns out that it worked. But Sun Microsystems owns the trademark to JavaScript. So JavaScript is not an open name. The language isn't trademarked. You can't copyright the language. Because I'll tell you why later, because it turned into a standard. But Sun Microsystems owns the name JavaScript, and only Netscape could call it JavaScript. They were the only ones that were given permission to call this language JavaScript. And so that created more problems where we have even more names for the exact same language. We already have two, and you'll see how this evolved to the next name for this language, which was JScript. Because many people know about the lawsuit between Netscape and Microsoft because of antitrust laws. Basically, Microsoft was using their power and might in a capitalist society to get a monopolistic market share of the browser. So they wanted to eradicate Netscape. And so they started pre-installing Internet Explorer onto the Windows operating system. So the people who purchased Windows didn't need to install Netscape, the browser. Well, of course, that led to all sorts of lawsuits. Now, Microsoft at the time was looking at the relationship between Netscape and Sun Microsystems, or JavaScript. What Netscape was doing with JavaScript, it looked at that and said, wow, that's what we want to do with our browser. There's no way we can compete unless we introduce a third language so that people can build better web apps. So Microsoft was loving what they were doing, but obviously it didn't love it because it's in competition with them. And there was even some people in Netscape saying, we're going to destroy Microsoft because we are introducing this technology and it's ours, and so on and so forth. And Microsoft said, well, we don't want to be destroyed. Of course, no corporate entity or any company wants to be destroyed. So they said, we don't want to be destroyed. And it turns out that obviously didn't destroy Microsoft. Microsoft is well and alive today, unfortunately. And it turns out what will destroy Microsoft is Windows 8.1. But Microsoft took the JavaScript engine, they reversed engineered it so there's no copyright whatsoever. And then they changed the name because JavaScript, don't forget, is owned by Sun Microsystems. So Microsoft can't use that name JavaScript. So what did they decide to do? Well, they gave it a third name. So we're still talking about the exact same language. So now we have three silly names for one silly language, and that is JScript. So there's the other name for this language, JScript. And Microsoft owns the trademark to JScript. So again, JavaScript and JScript are not open. They are, to this day, owned by corporate entities, those trading names. Now, Netscape looked at this with alarm because they realized, hold on a minute, all these different browser vendors can produce a browser, but the language isn't standardized. Now, HTML is standardized, CSS is standardized. Now, yes, we have our bugs, we have our problems, but overall, it's extremely cross-platform, and that's what makes web apps beautiful. And so, keeping in the spirit of web apps, Netscape realized that LiveScript, JavaScript, or JScript, whatever you want to call this language, needs to be standardized to stop browser vendors mucking things up, creating their own syntax with this language. And then that makes it a much tougher job for web developers. So Netscape was smart. They realized what was going off. They realized they didn't want the language to fail by letting it fragment, and then everybody will be calling for a non-fragmented language, and that'll just eradicate their idea altogether. So they were very, very smart, very, very clever company, and they wanted to go originally to the W3C. The W3C were waiting a very long time to tell Netscape to go to hell, and that's exactly what they did. The W3C said to Netscape, go to hell. And that was very short-sighted of the W3C. It's one of those things in their history that they probably wanted to sweep under the carpet. And that was very bad of them. So Netscape then, they went around Europe and so on and so forth. There's quite a few bodies you can go to. ISO was one of them, and there's a few others. But eventually they ended up at the ECMA, or ECMA, and that stands for the European Computer Manufacturers Association. And when they said, yes, we'll turn this language into a standard, ECMA couldn't come up with a name for this language. So they gave it the worst possible name you could ever imagine, which is ECMAScript, which is an awful, awful name for any language, no matter what it is. It's an awful name for the language. However, the ECMA body has been wonderful to this language. It's ensured its survivability in a web app-based environment, whereby that, okay, we always have inconsistencies between languages that are standardized thanks to browser vendors, but however, 99% of it is standardized, and that makes creating web apps a delight. So when ECMA brings out a new version, they're bringing out a new version of this language. So you could say a new version of JavaScript, a new version of JScript. You could even give it the really old name of LiveScript, which pretty much died in the 90s with Netscape. But you could call it LiveScript if you really wanted to. But the true name is ECMAScript. That's the one that you should call it. But if I put this course up and said, would you like to learn ECMAScript? A lot of people wouldn't actually know what that is, and I had no idea behind the history of this language at all. But when you do, it's actually very interesting. You sort of learn a lot more about the language. You now can see how the confusion can spread. You also know a lot about the heritage, and I think that gives you a stronger sense to learn the language. And ECMA's been very, very good. They will release a new version. They're releasing ECMAScript 6, or you can say ECMA version 6. But the latest version is ECMAScript 6, which is coming out in 2015. A lot of it hasn't actually been brought into browsers yet. But there are some new features that you can play around with in today's web browsers with this language. The most adopted is ECMAScript version 5. Version 5 is the most popular. It has the most support of modern day browsers, and it gives you an immense amount of power compared to ECMAScript 3, which was brought out in 1999. But even then, it still had some fantastic features, but there were some dangerous features as well. Well, that is the history of this language, and I hope that you enjoy learning about this language. I hope that you play around with it, and that is the history behind the language.